So I'm kind of checking news headlines every day, and part of my normal morning process and protocol is I'll bring up CNN and I'll just kind of get the day's news, and I'll read the Democrat and see what's going on. And it kind of occurred to me, I see this symptom of something happening, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. If I'm noticing themes and things going on in the world today, and I think deep down it has to do with people not always understanding how valuable they are to God, not always understanding their value in terms of the gospel message. And so our lesson today, the grand design, something out of nothing, comes to us, Psalm 19:1. And where I got the name for this, okay, is I finished reading this book by Stephen Hawking a while back. Do any of you know Stephen Hawking? He was a great scientific mind of our time, okay? He was a physicist, quantum physics. And this is him. You might recognize him. He suffered from some physical maladies during his life that confined him to a wheelchair, but his mind was never confined, okay? And he wrote this book called The Grand Design. And with the help of a kind of a ghost author, he created this book outlining his theory of everything. And that theory of everything was called M theory. M theory. He claims this theory, once he develops and polishes it, would be the answer to Einstein's search for a unified scientific theory that explains everything. Everything, right? Kind of makes sense so far? So I read this book, and in the book, he starts saying things like, there's no need for God, no need for a creator, no need for heaven, just everything tied up nice and neat in one big, self-sustaining scientific system with a bow on top. And I knew he would have some interesting points like this, though I have to admit I didn't find the book very compelling. When it comes to science, Stephen Hawking was top-notch. When it comes to talking about the kingdom of God, however, he was a layman. In chapter 1 of his book, for example, and I pulled a quote from it, he says, "Why are we here? Where do we come from? Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy." And then he says, "Philosophy is dead." The rest of the book, he happens to lay out his personal philosophy on how the universe can exist without God. This is true. And when I noticed this, I thought, well, maybe it's just me. I'm not as smart as Stephen Hawking, so I went online, I Googled it, and other people caught that also. And it's a fascinating, circular reasoning mistake from one of the brightest minds of our time. Top-notch with science when it comes to the things of God, just a layperson. And that's where the conclusion of the book got interesting. Now, he uses some scientific language here, and I'm only going to read a paragraph, so hang with me. In the last chapter, Stephen Hawking says, because gravity shapes space and time, it allows space and time to be locally stable, but globally unstable. On the scale of the entire universe, the positive energy of the matter can be balanced by the creation of whole universes. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God, he says, to set things moving. This is the conclusion, one of the last paragraphs in his book. Now, friends, I got to tell you, it occurs to me that laws like gravity exist and might govern something the size of our universe. That's fine, of course, that's true, but it doesn't answer the question, who or what ordered that law in the first place? In fact, when we keep going backwards, then eventually we always seem to end up, I think, at something that looks created or designed. It never fails. It seems then that philosophy is not dead. Not even for these rigid scientific assertions. Take for a moment cellular biology. We used to think in the olden days that when we got smaller and smaller, things would become more simple and easier for us to analyze. We used to think that complex organisms were made up of basic particles. I don't know if you remember this. But guess what happens when we look at things under an electron microscope at a molecular level? We see complexity, design, and tiny parts working together like a universe inside of a universe. It's absolutely fascinating, friends. The more deeply we go, the more we see design. Now, in talking about this morning, a lot of us have no struggle or no problem with this ideology, but a lot of people out there do. And it's the way they talk and it's the way they think. And Hawking, in fact, addresses this backward regression in the same way by employing one of atheist Richard Dawkins' favorite counter-arguments for God. If you know Richard Dawkins, he was in the media a lot 8 or 10 years ago for saying things against God. And in essence, it goes like this. If there is a God, then who created him? Have you heard this one? And then he stops there. He doesn't go on. That's his counter-argument. Too simple for me. It seems too simple. We know from the Bible that God is described as having always existed. No end and no beginning. He is the Alpha and the Omega. Christians get this. It doesn't bother us. What does the book of Genesis say on page 1? Page 1. In the beginning, what happened? God created the heavens and the earth. Not they created themselves. If we go further, John 1:1-3, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. There was a creator. Gravity, however, as Stephen Hawking says, did not create itself. And the different laws of nature, I maintain, did not invent themselves either. They didn't just spring up one day and go from there. Since we have things that exist as complicated as universes, or take even, for example, black holes. We're just learning about this stuff, where we cannot see an end or a beginning. Is this concept of being eternal really so hard to imagine for people like Hawking and Dawkins? Now, if we are to believe these types of things, that the universe and everything in it just showed up one day with no creator, that scientific laws invent themselves, that everything comes down to just biology, then something interesting happens. It produces symptoms that go out into our world that I see in news headlines and people out there. And what happens is that people begin to think they aren't that important. They aren't that significant. That we're simply animals and nothing more. And if we are just animals, then we are no more important or meaningful than a frog or a tree. Now, it sounds silly when I say this out loud, but there are entire groups of people that think like this. It allows for some people to divest themselves of any moral obligation, I think. In other words, if I am just an animal who evolved over time with no creator and no higher calling, then I can do whatever I want in this world as long as it suits me and as long as it's legal, right? Look out. I don't have to follow any moral code. I don't need to study the Bible. I don't need to think any further than planning out how to get what I want from a day-to-day basis. The ends justify the means. You see the spiritual dilemma with this, raised by the idea that nothing caused everything, that we are just accidents. Friends, you are not accidents. If we look at Scripture, like Psalm 19:1, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." Or how about Romans 1:20, which says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." Now, that doesn't mean we don't have doubts sometimes as Christians, or we can't have doubts, or we can't talk about unbelief. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is God is there if we look for him. He always has been. The Bible says we are without excuse. He's there. I also read a book a while back by Alvin Plantinga. Plantinga is a top-notch Christian philosopher and author, teacher, and writer. And he talks about something called the fine-tuning argument. And the fine-tuning argument is basically a way of him to say, if we look out into the heavens and we look at everything in the earth, we end up seeing God because it's too much, too well calculated, too well put together to be accidental. That's the idea. Everything around us is finely tuned enough for human life, for the way the earth and the heavens came together. And he offers the following example, if any of you play cards. He gives the example of poker. Sitting around a card table, the dealer passes out 5 cards. Maybe you're playing 5-card draw, I don't know. And when you're playing poker, you're playing cards, how common is it to get 4 aces every hand? Not so common. And he sets up his little story in the Wild West, and he says if you're playing around a table with cowboys, and every time they deal out a hand, you get 4 aces. 4 aces. 4 aces. 4 aces. And Tex doesn't like that, sitting across from you at the table. So he gets up, pulls out his 6-shooter. He's going to suspect that you are cheating. Okay? So Alvin Plantinga looks around the universe and everything in it, and how water is H2O is just the perfect solvent, and how oxygen is just perfectly combined, and all these things fall into place such that human life can flourish and take off. And he says, if you're trying to claim it's all accidental, sooner or later I'm going to suspect you're cheating. Okay? 4 aces. 4 aces. All the time. Fine-tuning. At any rate, I couldn't mask my disappointment with the book. After reading the conclusion, I think he is basically telling us that because there are laws that exist that use positive and negative energy, everything can just spring up from nothing. And we're to accept this, and we're to call it M theory. If I oversimplified what he was trying to say, maybe I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert in quantum physics. Many of you know me, I'm kind of nerdy, I like to read that stuff. And you guys have to listen to it this morning, so sorry. But it bothers me deep down when I read this stuff. And I see these circular reasoning mistakes, and I understand that not everybody is seeing that, and so they're accepting the idea that they're accidents. It bugs me. And this book was written for the ordinary person, but the problem is, the reason we're given as to why anything exists at all is too ordinary. Anyone can choose not to believe in God, okay? He allows us to do that. But it's something entirely different to claim that we can disprove God. I don't buy that one. Spiritual cues may be subtle sometimes, but they are never absent. Look around you today, friends. Forget science for a minute. I've heard so many stories from all of you about how God has worked in your lives, so many testimonies, so many answered prayers. I've heard about Liz Stewart. She isn't here today, I don't think. Every time she goes to MD Anderson Hospital, that she tells the doctors she's a walking miracle. I've heard how Kathy Warner, sorry to embarrass you, Kathy, loves God, and how when she loves God, people around her took notice, and they said, I want what she's got. And so many others in this church who have experienced God personally, so many others of you, and they know He's real. They know it. Case closed. There's none of this who created God business. Friends, we need not think that we're just accidents, or that we're nothing more than a natural set of laws. And you know this, don't you? You know this. We are called to be so much more than that. To know and to understand that we are loved and cherished by a Creator, and that He wants all of us to return to Him someday when we depart. He wishes that none of us stay lost or separated from Him, so He sends us Jesus. But when I look around outside today, sometimes I see the symptom around us where people don't know that they're not accidents. People don't understand how important they are. people who feel lost, who read these books, and they think there's no God. And they feel alone, helpless, frustrated. Because this physical life isn't enough by itself. It isn't enough to keep us driven, joyful. It's not enough to sustain our spirit. Well, of course, Stephen Hawking is no longer with us. He passed on in 2018. A sad day for science people and academics alike. And to my knowledge, as of today, M theory has not panned out successfully. And even though it may not have come to fruition, I'm betting it will still be talked about for some time in the scientific community, and that's fine. But I think it was another attempt to explain away the need for a personal creator. And it reminds me that no matter how smart we think we are, God remains at the center of everything. We can and should use our intellect to explore this incredible world we live in, but we need not erase God while we do it. Make those scientific discoveries, create those life-saving vaccines, and give glory to God at the same time. Science and faith do not have to conflict. It is a far more rewarding universe with God in it, as it was always meant to be. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, you are the one true creator. You created the heavens and the earth. We know this not just because the Bible tells us, but because we can look around and see it. Evidence for you shows up everywhere. Let your light be what guides us as we search for meaning. Remind us constantly that we are not accidents. Our children are not accidents. You know every hair on their head, and that we are loved.